So, in this episode, we see that Iris is still continuing to write about Flash. And despite the warning from both Barry and her father, Iris is very, very determined in this episode to write about the Flash, and I really, really like that. Iris is very much like Lois Lane, because we're more than likely never gonna get a Lois Lane in this CW universe. I really like the idea that Iris is really filling that shoe, and I just really like the way that Iris's character is developing. She calls the Flash the Streak in this episode, and that sort of reflects back on Arrow Season 1 and how people called Arrow the Hood Guy or the Vigilante in those first few episodes. That's sort of what's happening in this episode. That's sort of what's happening in this episode. In regards to the warnings of the dangerous predicament that Iris is putting herself in, one of Iris's and Barry's bullies that they had growing up comes into contact with Iris in this episode. The person is called Tony, and what Tony does is Tony threatens Iris in order to get to the Flash. And that's such a Lois Lane kind of thing to do. Because Iris is on the byline, a lot of people in comic books seem to think that the reporter knows everything about the individual. So now we get on to Flash himself. And we see in this episode Barry really, really struggling with that. Barry has always been says in this episode that he's always been the type of character who runs away from bullies. And in this and because of that, he's never trained himself to fight, to go against people. And that's what we see in this episode. We see Flash start to begin his combat training as a vigilante. Unlike Oliver Queen, Barry doesn't have any formal training. And that's sort of another thing that separates these two characters. And the way Barry fights is so interesting. What I really like about how I'm guessing Barry's combat training is going to develop, a lot of it will depend on Barry's speed ability. I really, really like that idea, because the show is basically utilizing Barry's power and turning it into some kind of combat training. And as I say, I really, really like that idea. And it's also interesting to see how Flash uses that speed combat training when he goes up against Tony. Harrison Weld and Detective West continue their investigate Barry's mother. And Harrison Wells is really, really interesting in this episode. I'll be quite curious as to see whether Harrison Wells is actually Reverse Flash, because there are several moments in this episode that that implicate Harrison Wells, and we also get to learn what Harrison Wells' backstory is. But it's quite interesting to think about whether that was fabricated because he came from the future, or whether he did actually meet his wife in the past. It's all very, very interesting. Yeah, all in all, this is a very, very good episode, and I just really, really liked it. It's certainly a very, very different episode to what we've been having.